Let's look at each layer of an 1850s and early 1860s woman's dress. Good day everyone, my name is Caitlin. I'm a living historian who educates other living historians by teaching old-fashioned sewing skills and copying original garments. This video is part of a segment called Improve Your Impression, where we go through, take a particular time period for an entire year and deep dive into that time period to really improve ourselves as living historians. And this particular year we are doing 1853 to 1862. So we've already discussed where to find primary research. We have discussed finding fabrics, making patterns. We've made nightgown, we've made a dress. So now we're going to talk about putting it all together, like actually dressing the woman, going into all the layers. We're not going to obviously be able to do every single garment that a woman could have owned or could have worn, but we're going to try to cover as much ground as we possibly can and at least get some of the detail in there. So I know that when we did patterns and did fabrics, we actually did briefly look into the layers, but I do want to do a little bit more in depth today. We're going to start with footwear, beginning with stockings. Both hand and machine knit stockings would be available in this time, although machine-made store-bought stockings do appear to be more popular and more common. Although very slightly out of our time frame, I'm going to read a little bit from Virginia Penny's 1863 work, Employments of Women, on her section of hosiery. The majority of her research was done in the late 1840s and throughout the 1850s to very early 1860s, so although the book wasn't published till 63, a lot of the information is still very applicable to our time period. Quote, "Hosiers. Cotton, woolen, linen, and silk are the kinds of hose common to us. The manufacture of hose worn by Americans is mostly English. The amount of capital required and the small number of good operatives in our country cause the products of some of our manufacturers to be of an inferior quality. Years back, knitting was much done, particularly in the country, but the general use of machinery has superseded the knitting needle." End quote. I was able to find a few advertisements from our time period. So in 1860 in Boston, there was a glove and hosiery manufacturer that said they had, quote, "silk, woolen, worsted, and cotton of all the various styles and qualities," end quote. I even found an 1861 advertisement for theatrical hosiery, which was quite interesting. They sold comic and striped stockings, worsted, silk, and cotton tights in all colors and shades. White stockings are going to be the most practical and the most widely seen in photographs, even on working women. I have, however, found references in our time period to various other colors, including black, which does also seem to be popular, particularly black silk stockings, and not just used for mourning. I have also found some references to striped stockings, although most of those do seem to be for children and infants. I have found a couple of references for adult wear as well. Now, this is technically an era before synthetic dyes really took off. Yes, there are synthetic dyes. The aniline dyes were technically patented and started to be marketed in 1855, which is in our time period, yes. Most people don't actually know a lot about the aniline dyes. So first of all, they really only work on protein fibers like silk and wool. They did not work on cotton or linen. So those nice bright shades that you see with aniline dyes or were created with aniline dyes are not on cellulose fibers. Secondly, it wasn't as if all the colors were created at once and marketed at once. The beginning ones were the cool colors, so blue was first, and then green and purple, and it wasn't until post our time period that we started seeing the warm colors in the aniline dyes, such as red, orange, and yellow. So when you look for stockings, particularly cotton stockings, which most living historians do tend to prefer, you're going to want stockings in a shade and a color that is easily achievable in natural dyes. Now, I do have a series on natural dyeing, which may help you match some of the shades if you're out there searching. Stockings I find to be the easiest things to get as far as reproductions today. There are several places that do specialize them, and several mercantile stores such as Carter and Jasper's, which is on Etsy. Samson Historical does have good stockings that do work for our time period as well. What you're looking for is something that isn't too terribly tight on your leg. You don't want it to cut off circulation. You're also looking for something that has no or extremely little synthetic or elastic qualities to it. You want something that is going to be mostly, if not all, the fiber that is being sold as, so cotton, silk, wool, that sort of thing. Most places that cater to the historical crowd are going to have passable stockings. Even the settlers who don't seem to get most of their historic stuff right tend to get the stockings right, so it's something that's fairly safe to look for. Now, you are always welcome to knit your own. If you do, you are better than me. I'm such a slow knitter, I've never attempted stockings because it would take me several years to make a single one, but there are stocking knitting books or books specifically on knitting stockings from the period that you may use. One is called the Knitting Teaching teacher's assistant. It was published first in 1817 and then published, from what I can tell, without changes well into the 1890s, about every decade or so. So it's a very period appropriate stocking knitting guide. It has various sizes. It is written in quite an odd style. It is more like a question answer type, instead of just the directions being listed out as we would do today. It is more of a question answer. So like it would be two characters talking back and forth. One would say, oh, how many to cast on for this size? And then the answer would be, oh, you cast on 22 for this size. So it's a little strange, but if you're willing to work past that, it's absolutely doable. Now there is a person on Etsy, at least last I checked, I'll double check, but it's PhunKnits, P-H-U-N knits, and she has translated that guide into modern knitting directions. So it's the same pattern, but it's just translated to a more modern audience. So if you are interested in knitting, that also may be a good option for you. So let's go ahead and move on to garters. Garters is something I rarely see people do correctly, and I would love to see more garters within living history. We have, even most of our reproduction stockings have a fair bit of elastic in them to keep those stockings up, so people just don't technically need them like they would have back in the day, and so we tend to just not wear them very often. But even if you don't physically need them to hold your stockings, they are still very good to add to your impression. Occasionally they will get seen every once in a while, and it's just a good thing to have, as it really adds to the authenticity because they would have been wearing them. So last year I did do a whole 100 years of garters from 1780, I believe, 1770, I think, to 1870. So I will link that below. It goes into a little bit more detail than I'm going to go here. Of course, knitted garters would be appropriate. You're looking for something in a very fine wool, like a fingering weights or something like that. And a variety of colors. A plain garter stitch knit garter is perfectly fine. I'm convinced that's why we call it a garter stitch. It's because that stitch makes really good garters. It's an excellent project for the beginning knitter who just wants to try something out. And the bonuses, if you really mess up, they're still typically fairly usable and no one gets to see them. So it can be a great way to dip your feet into knitting. From what I can tell, it does seem like the elastic garter is the most popular garter of the time period, even superseding knitting, because they were very cheap and could be bought instead of having to spend the time to do it yourself. You're looking for elastic that is knitted, preferably in a natural like latex, and then cotton if you can, which is somewhat hard to find. You're looking for about 1 inch widths, and you want it to be like a knitted elastic so you can actually see the knit stitches. In my opinion, garters are one of those things that if you have some synthetic content, it's not as big of a deal with garters specifically with other things because they're not directly touching your skin, or you have your stocking underneath. Therefore, if something were to catch fire or to start smoldering, the synthetic would actually melt into the garment you have between your skin and the synthetic, as opposed to being directly on your skin. So in my opinion, it is a little bit safer than, say, having anything else with synthetics in it. Typically, garters of this time period, especially the elastic ones, are going to clip in front with, I call it a lock and key clasp. I'm sure that's not the correct term, but I do show you on the garter video what I'm talking about. Other styles of elastic garters can be the elastic band with a little bit of needlepoint in front. Most often I see these worked in what's called Penelope canvas, oftentimes with silk embroidery, and sometimes in cross stitch, sometimes in a half cross stitch. It seems very strange to us that elastic was available and readily available in this time period as well. The steamboat Arabia, which sank in 1855, carrying goods to more rural areas, sank with hundreds of elastic garters. You can see there's a picture with all the clips that they found, but only one of them had the original elastic still on it, and I have it in the middle. It's a very cool thing to see. Now, garters may be worn above or below your knee as preference or your body dictates. I have been told so many times that I am incorrect and inauthentic for wearing my garters below my knee, when there is perfectly acceptable period evidence for both. Yes, above the knee would be more common, but it is not unusual to see garters below the knee as well. If I try to wear my garters above the knee, they would just slide right off and therefore cease to function as garters. Every body is different, and where that concave is, where it would actually hold a garter but not slip down, it's going to be different in every single person. Ideally, you try above the knee. If it slips off, try below the knee. Now, Grandma's magazine in this time here did have a very short article regarding above or below the knee for garters, where it does suggest that above the knee is more common, and that there may be some prevailing thought that wearing it below the knee would cause your knee to change shape and become misshapen. So it does discuss that, and I'll read the quote here. Quote, "We ask if it may be possible that one can destroy the proportions of a well-shaped leg by gartering the stocking below the knee. Look at the statue of a Venus and in thought draw a band or elastic under the knee. Would not the result be a deformity? But harmony of the lines are not disturbed. It becomes an ornament." End quote. Regardless of any prevailing thoughts, the fact remains that every body is different and there is evidence for both above and below the knee garter. So do what you need to do to keep that garter on. Saying that one way is more or less correct than the other is a mistake. We can say that one was more popular or perhaps more common than the other, but we cannot say one or the other is wrong or incorrect. That's why it's so important on really any subject not to find a single source and wave it around as if it was some sort of magical authority. There are millions of people in the 1850s and 1860s, all with very slight differences in preferences and needs, beliefs and opinions from one another. For instance, you can find entire articles on how vulgar it was for women to have pockets in their dresses. And yet, when I look at original garments, and I have studied hundreds in person, about 98% of them have pockets in their skirts. Just because one or two people had the opinion that pockets were vulgar does not mean that the vast majority of people felt that way. And that is why it's so important not to look at one thing and hold it as an authority, but instead to look at a more well-rounded view of several people's thoughts and opinions, or as many as we can get, and draw conclusions on what was happening and what was not happening, or what was more common or less common. Now, at the very tail end of our time period, I did find something interesting in Godey's Lady's Book. It's 1861, so again, kind of towards the tail end here. But it seems to suggest that somewhat of a garter belt, as in elastic being attached at the drawers and then also buttoning at the stockings to hold them up, as we would think of like a 20th century garter belt. This does not seem to catch on, because even in later photographs where we actually see the garters, it's very clear that they're not being suspended like that. But it could be an option, or at least a discussion point, post 1861 it looks like. So I'll read that quote. "Something better than garters. Procure a sufficient quantity of cotton elastic ribbon. Make a buttonhole at one end and place a button on the other. Fasten a loop to the upper part of the stocking with which to button the one end of the elastic. The other end may be buttoned onto the inside of the band of the drawers. A trial of this plan with children has given great satisfaction and much improved the appearance of their stockings." End quote. I find it adorable because a lot of children did not wear garters. It was mostly just, young adults and women who are wearing them, and you see a lot of droop stockings in portraiture, which I think is adorable. Now, some of them actually were wearing garters, but it does seem to be quite rare, as the prevailing thought of the day was that children should have nothing confining on them, that they should be, loose and free. I know it seems kind of intuitive because they are wearing a lot of layers, but the layers are important for other reasons. The important thing is to not have anything super tight or restricting on them, such as a garter would be. And no, the stays worn by children are not confining or tight. So now let's talk shoes. At the very beginning of our time period, our shoes are still more of the older style, which is no heel or very slight heel, less than half an inch. Around 1855, the heel becomes very popular very quickly. So we're seeing, and when I say heel, we're talking like half an inch to 1 inch of a heel. It's not very significant whatsoever, but it's still a slight heel. So most of us for this particular time period are going to want boots with slight heels, like an inch or so. The exception to that would be slippers, which I find have very minimal to no heel until a little bit after our time period. All footwear, shoes, slippers, boots, all of those are still going to have that square toe that has been predominant really since 1825. It doesn't change until after our time period. Slippers can be made of silk, they can be made of leather, they can also be made of needlework for household use. Boots or shoes can be made of leather, they can be made of silk, they can be made of velvet, they can be made of wool. The fabric ones can just be fabric, or they can have foxing, which is leather at the toe and also perhaps at the heel, which is the areas where you'd mostly see the wear on a shoe, so make it last a little bit longer. Boots and shoes at this time period can close with lacing, either at the sides or at the front. They can close with buttons or with elastic gussets, although I will say you see more elastic gussets in the later part of the 1860s, a little bit past our time period, but they are an option for our time period as well. As far as where to get them today, I just saw, I think it was like yesterday, Amazon Dry Goods, the new proprietress, Michaela, just posted a beautiful medium blue boot that she's going to have for sale pretty soon. I really wish I needed more shoes at this point because they're absolutely gorgeous, but they will be selling some shoes. I don't know what all the colors are going to be, but those are side lacing boots. They have the correct heel. They're very beautifully proportioned. It's hard to find shoes right now because so many of the good businesses we used to have are going out of business. So Footwear, I believe, is gone now. Robert Land has retired. So it's just hard to find good shoes for this time period. It looks like Amazon Dry Goods is going to continue to be our main source for that. American Duchess does carry shoes as well. I find if you are doing any type of work for living history, I would not suggest American Duchess. They do not withstand the regular use, essentially. They are fantastic shoes for photo shoots. They are great shoes for sitting or in a parlor or taking short promenades through a garden, but they are not last being used shoes. And they're fairly on the expensive side for not being able to last as usable shoes. So I would avoid those unless again, you're more of a parlor sitter, or if you are more of a house docent, then American Duchess shoes might be good for you. There's also the option of buying used. I have seen several groups that I'm in, Facebook groups that I'm in, I often see shoes come up for sale for fairly inexpensively. Sometimes if you get to know the people around you and they have shoes for sale, you can always buy, again, used shoes. That's where my current 1850s and 1860s boots are from. I bought them off Alicia for like $100, I think, which is expensive for me for shoes, but it's inexpensive for period shoes. And they were Robert Land boots, which are very much in demand because, again, he's retired and he's one of the best shoemakers we've ever had. And then even as I was writing this script, my friend Susan just picked up a pair of Robert Land slippers, which I think she spent like $60 for them. It was really inexpensive. Anyway, they're definitely out there and they are cheaper than buying new. It's more economical, but you do have to like watch and wait for them. Now, if you're adventurous, there's always the 1855 reprint of Every Lady Her Own Shoemaker. It just tells you how to make your own shoes. It has some very basic fundamental patterns that you would have to resize to yourself. But I find the directions fairly straightforward. I was able to make some children's shoes with that just fine. It's just, I think it's a little bit more than most people are going to be willing to put up with. I now have the concept of shoemaking. I just have to get the courage to actually make my own shoes now. It would be nice to have an extra pair or two. So now that we've talked about footwear, we're going to talk about underwear. We're going to start with chemises. There are several types of chemises that were popular in this time period. We have the typical round yoke chemise. I just did a DIY here's how to do it without a pattern video that I will link below. There are the what I call the shaped yoke chemises, which are absolutely gorgeous. We'll be doing that later on this year. You see some that are very highly decorated, very beautiful, and you also see them quite plain and everywhere in between. Chemises are almost always going to be white, and that stark printer paper white. Bleach fabrics absolutely did exist back then, and they were very much used, especially for underwear, because it was easy to keep things white and fresh looking through bluing, which is part of the laundry process, through boiling, through sun bleaching. All that sort of thing is, it makes whites keep better than natural dyes, is essentially what it comes down to, particularly on cotton and linen. Chemises in this time period do have sleeves. There is a common misconception that there is a type of ball gown chemise that does not have a sleeve. Sleeveless chemises are way past our time period, so your chemise should have sleeves. Even if they're a little bit smaller, a couple inches, it should still have sleeves. If you are going to trim your chemise, I've only seen trim around the neckline and the front and also on the sleeve. I have a couple of resources listed below on how to make your own chemises from the period. These are basically the guides that I use to make my own DIY videos, and sometimes people find the videos easier to follow. I will of course have those resources linked below for you. I'm going to read from one here just to kind of give you a little bit more idea about chemises. This is actually from the Household Encyclopedia. It is published in 1858. This exact quote, more or less, there's a few slight changes, was also published in 1853, so it's a great one for most of our time period. It says, quote, chemises. There is considerable variety in the formation of women's inner garments. According to this variety, it will require from 25 to 27 yards of a yard-wide linen or calico to make 12 plain chemises of a full medium size, or such as are sufficiently large for most persons. Some persons like to have their sleeves made full, others cut either straight or angularly, and set into stitch bands like those of petticoats. Sometimes a 3/4 bit is added across at the shoulders and a button being sewn at the joint of the sleeve, and the angular bit of the piece is just mentioned secured to it so as to pass over the cover of the strap of the stays. Others again prefer their chemises to be cut out round the neck and trimmed, or else be cut with lappets. If the former method be adopted, a rather small quantity of linen will suffice, as some of the gussets may be cut from the pieces sloped out. Some persons put 2 full breadths of linen into a chemise, and should the material be only 7/8 wide, this may occasionally be desirable. Respecting the length of these chemises, some calculate it to be for the chest only and add narrow strips, which form the shoulders. This is a very economical mode, and when lappets are not considered essential, it answers very well, especially for children. For a person of 5 feet 2 inches in height, one chemise will require 2.5 yards, for a dozen about 30 yards. End quote. And then it tells you how to make it, but that's a little bit beyond the scope of this video, because again, we already have tutorials on that on the channel. Now let's talk about drawers. These are going to be split crotch in this time period. They are also stark printer paper white the vast majority of the time. They do tend to be fairly popular, particularly after the introduction of the crinoline. There are several ways to wear these base underpinnings from what I can tell. It's either, let's see, drawers first and then put the chemise and then put your corset on. So your chemise is kind of just out almost like a petticoat. Or you can do chemise first, drawers over top, and you drawers over top, and you tuck your chemise and then wear your corset. And I also understand that there's also, chemise, drawers, chemise is tucked, and then, chemise, corset, and then you put your drawers over top, and then you tuck that into your, and you tuck your chemise into your drawers as well. So as far as I can tell, all of those are appropriate ways. It very much depends on personal preference. I have a personal preference that you've likely seen. If you've seen any of my getting dressed videos, you will see that I have one way of doing things. That's just my way of doing things. It doesn't mean that there aren't other ways that you could be wearing or layering those particular layers. That just means that that's how I prefer it. Drawers may be decorated or plain. Typically when you see decorations on drawers, it's only going to be at the hem, at the very bottom part. You see shirring, you'll see embroidery, like Swiss embroideries. You'll see some like knitted lace type things. You're going to see tucks. So many ways to decorate your drawers if you choose. If you choose any type of knitted lace or white work edging or anything like that, don't ruffle it. You want it set plainly. It takes less of the material, so it's cheaper that way. And also putting in ruffles, especially on those highly decorated white work embroideries, the folds hide the beauty of the embroidery, and you want that to be, if you're going to spend money on embroidery like that, you want it to be shown. And so setting it plainly allows you to view the beauty of that piece more than if you ruffled it. I know for modern people, we really like the look of a ruffled lace or a ruffled trim, and that's just not what they did in this time period. Ruffling is later than our time period. And also, you don't want any ribbon or anything that isn't white on your drawers. Drawers are meant to be washable, and so the ribbons or anything like that, it would not be correct for this time period. Drawers should hit about mid-calf, a little bit lower than mid-calf, somewhere in there is where they should hit if you choose to wear them. Most drawers are going to close with buttons and buttonholes, usually in the back, not always, but usually in the back. I've seen a couple with ties in the back. That is fairly rare. I've seen like a couple with a form of a drawstring. Usually it's fitted in the front and then like a little bit of a drawstring in the back, just like a couple of inches. And it's not going to, these aren't meant to be multi-sized. They're like all garments in this time period made fairly specifically to the particular person who's wearing them. So we don't see a lot of drawstrings. It's mostly going to be fitted waistbands. Now let's talk about the corset. Let's first talk about the purpose of a corset. There's a lot of information. There's lots of misinformation. Every time I think that the corset myths are mostly dying, I get somebody on a comment somewhere very, very angry that I say corsets aren't terrible, and they aren't. Corsets are not meant to pull in your waist. Now for some people they naturally do. For other people they do not. For instance, my waist measurement does not change when I'm in a 19th century corset. Many, many years ago, my waist did actually change a little bit. No more than a couple of inches. It's never been more than 2.5 inches for me. And for some people, their waist measurements do change. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's also not a bad thing if your corset does not change your waist measurement, because that's not the purpose. The purpose is bras were not invented yet, and we need something to hold up the bust line, especially to shape it correctly, to hold it at the right height. They tended to prefer their bust line higher than it sits today with a modern bra. They liked it just a little bit higher, a little bit, I guess, perkier. Not too much, maybe maybe an inch or so. It shouldn't feel like you have bosoms, at your chin level. They should be a little bit lower than that, but it is higher than perhaps we see with modern bras today. So that is the main purpose, the shaping and the support of bosoms. That is what a corset is for. Now there are secondary, very wonderful reasons to wear a corset. One is the back support. Love my corset for back support. It is absolutely amazing. A good mid-19th century corset is a wondrous thing. We're not going to have corsets that go above our bust. They sit kind of right above that nipple line or right at that nipple line. They're fairly short in the hips too, so it's nothing like those super long ones. They're very easy to move in. You can have something that's very lightly boned or something heavier boned. Whatever you prefer is, within the boning structure is fine. You can have ones that are corded with like a cotton yarn. You can have them more quilted. There's lots of options for you as far as corsetry goes. It's not just one size or one style fits all. There are different ways to make a corset. There are different patterns to use. You have the ones that are just completely shaped pieces. You have the ones that are very rectangular, and they have gussets or gores for the bust and the hips. So lots of options for you with corsetry. Bras are not invented, so bras are not appropriate for living history. The most appropriate would be a corset. And again, that doesn't mean you have to have something boned. If you can stand to have a bodice around you, you can stand to have a corded corset, and it would still hold everything up and give you that period shape. I will say, as far as the bust goes, so like how your corset opens, the front opening corset bust is very convenient. It is definitely around in this time period. I find it not to be the most common option. I think for living historians, we have more front opening corset busts than they would have had during our time period. I've even seen a few 1860s corsets that had that wooden or that bone bust in the front, as in previous time periods. I like to say, just because something is patented doesn't mean that it was mass marketed or extremely popular yet. Sometimes it takes a little bit for things to catch on, so to speak. So you may do either one as far as that goes. As far as the lacing goes, by this point, most of our corsets are going to lace with little metal grommets or eyelets. I've seen a couple of early 1850s corsets with the bone grommets or the bone eyelets, which you can still buy. I believe Mackenzie Schultz still sells them. I don't believe I've come across any like structural support corsets that have the hand-bound buttonholes, or sorry, the hand-bound eyelets. That does seem to be an earlier time period thing. It's mostly the metal ones at this point. There's also several ways to lace a corset, given portraiture and illustrations. Don't let everyone tell you there's only one way to lace a corset. There are other ways you can do it. If your corset, if you cannot get it comfortable, if you are struggling to lace it, it could just be the lacing itself, and you can take it out and do it a different way. Your clothes are supposed to work for you, so if something isn't working, let's figure out why that particular thing isn't working and see if we can fix that garment itself, or maybe we sell that garment and get you something that's period appropriate, that is within your comfort level. I think a lot of times we get very stuck on, well, this is how they looked back then, or this is it. There were different people at different abilities back then as well. And people, again, have different preferences. So some people prefer to have a couple of laces in the back to tighten separately. Some people prefer the one, which is what I prefer. I prefer what is now called bunny ears lacing, which is a period-appropriate way to lace your corset. It's my personal preference. Again, we've talked about preferences before. Just because you see only one way of doing things on my channel doesn't mean that it's the only way to do it. It just means that it's my preferred way to do it, which is why we see it on my channel, because it's my channel and I'm really the only person you see on this channel. So especially with corsetry, it's one of those things where I think it's very important, if you don't like your current corset, if it is uncomfortable, if it is pinching you, if there's something going wrong, let's figure that out. Let's figure out what's going on with you. This is a great opportunity to go find another female living historian to chat about this, someone who's a little bit more knowledgeable, who's been doing this a while, and troubleshoot with you about what we can do to either fix this particular garment, or again, we can always go and sell it to someone who it will work for and get something that will work for us. If you find that you're the type of person who cannot handle something around your stomach, who can't handle the structure of like a fully boned corset, maybe we're looking at something more like a corded pair of stays, which again is very much an option for you. As far as fabrics for corsets, we're going to look at, mostly at very sturdy fabrics. Coutil is around this time period. I'm not sure how exactly it translates to modern coutil, but it is around. I found references to it. Twill is going to be a popular one. Sateen you can use for corsets. Most corsets, again, are going to be white because, again, they're very easy to keep clean that way. The colored ones are almost always silk. I've seen some blue ones. I've seen orange ones. All sorts of colors. But again, majority of them are going to be white. And cotton is a normal fabric for corsets, but you also do see silk ones, and I've seen one or two that were wool as well. Let's briefly discuss corset covers. They are not a universal layer. Most women didn't wear them all the time because you don't have to. A corset cover, which is also called a petticoat body in this time period, both are interchangeable terms. It's basically only used if you absolutely need it. And when I say absolutely need it, if you are wearing a bodice that is unlined and partially sheer, or completely sheer, where you see your underpinnings underneath, that is your opportunity to wear a corset cover or a petticoat body. Otherwise, you don't need one. This is not a time period where they are normal, everyday bits of underwear. These corset covers are going to blend into your underwear, so it's going to be made out of the same fabric that a lot of your underwear is made from. Thing that matches your underwear, matches your petticoats, matches your chemises. The periods is often long cloth, which is basically just a plain bleached white cotton that's fairly opaque. Oftentimes these petticoat bodies or these corset covers are going to button down the front. I don't believe I've seen one that is high neck, like a jewel neck. I've only seen half high ones. I don't know if that's a trend or if that's just what I've seen. Sometimes they end at the waist, sometimes they have like a little bit of a peplum to them, which I find to be better because it stays down and stays in place a little bit better, at least in my experience, than the ones that just end at the waist. But both are period correct, both are fine. Occasionally they are somewhat decorated. This is especially nice with like a little bit of white work, a little bit of lace or something, especially under a very sheer bodice or basque, because that will show through. You will actually see that. Now let's talk skirt supports, starting with our primary petticoat, or what I call our primary petticoat. A lot of people will call this today a modesty petticoat. That is not, from what I can tell, a period term at all. That is something that modern people call it, and that's not necessarily its only purpose. There's a lot of purposes for this primary petticoat. This petticoat is most often going to be of white cotton. It can also be of wool flannel or just regular wool. It can be quilted, it can be knitted, but it's usually going to hit around mid-calf, a little bit lower than that, and it has a couple of purposes. It's not just a superficial layer. The main purpose is for ease of walking and ease of movement. I know it's super counterintuitive to modern people who don't understand how clothes work, that adding more skirts actually makes walking and moving easier, but it's true. So that smaller petticoat that's quite full, at least 90 inches in circumference, about 90 to about 110, 120 inches in circumference. So it's quite a wide skirt that's fairly short. Again, mid-calf, lower mid-calf, somewhere in there. So when you have that super full skirt that is short, that is walking, so you can easily go upstairs without tripping on it. You can do all sorts of movement, all sorts of daily tasks without tripping on it. What that does, it creates a barrier from your other skirts. Longer skirts are not as close to your body and not as close to your feet, meaning when it's windy, your skirts won't get tangled in your ankles as you move. When you're going upstairs, it means you can actually go upstairs without having to hold your long skirts up because you have this petticoat that's creating a barrier. I know a lot of people skip the primary petticoat. They just go straight to the petticoat that's almost as long as their skirt. And then they wonder why their skirts get heavy and drag when it gets wet or muddy or snowy. Or they wonder why, when it's windy out in the prairie, their skirts are getting completely tangled within their legs to where they can't move. And then they get frustrated and say, well, I don't know why anyone would wear this. This is stupid. Why were our ancestors so stupid? They're not the stupid ones. You're just not doing it right. The layers all have purposes. We like to think of them as just layers to add layers. Like their only purpose was to add more fabric, to be more modest, or because men force women to wear them. And none of those things are true. The layers all have very specific purposes. You have to have the chemise for sweat control. It keeps the cool, damp fabric next to your skin when a breeze comes through. It's like having a personal air conditioning unit. It also keeps your other garments clean to where you don't have to wash them very frequently. Same with the drawers. It's like a personal sanitation layer for anything that may be leaking or sweat or chafing. All of those things get handled by the drawers. Again, we've already talked about the purposes of the corset. And again, all the petticoats, everything has a very specific purpose. If you don't do it correctly, if you are not wearing the right layers, in the right fibers, in the right weights, in the right fabrics, you're not going to get the same experience that they did. And yes, there are going to be things that are very difficult for you. The problem isn't what our ancestors were wearing, it's how we're not doing exactly what they were doing. And therefore, what we are experiencing isn't what they're experiencing. That's why it's very important to get all of these details right. These details aren't just being snobby or being a stitch counter. It's actually for your comfort and safety. Like most things in this time period, these petticoats are not going to have drawstrings. They're going to almost always be buttoned in the back. Very occasionally I'll come across a drawstring again, but again, mostly buttoned. We've already talked about how long they should be, the types of fabrics they can be. We've already talked about the circumference of them. So I think that's about it for the primary petticoat. Very important layer. Please don't leave it off. It's a very good layer to have. It's not just a layer to add a layer. Next layer is technically optional. It would be the crinoline. I have a whole video on hoop mania. I'm not going to go too much into it. Once a hoop comes out, it is very common. We see it in factories, we see it on farms, we see it in housework, we see maids wearing them, we see people doing severe manual labor in crinolines. I would say they're not worn as often as they likely should be in living history because we tend to think that as a fashionable thing, and if we're being a poor working person, we're not going to wear one, when that doesn't always mesh well with historical documentation. There were some factories that actually had to ban the use of hoops, but most of them did not. And so just, using that one source of, well, not everyone wore hoops because look at this factory banned them. They banned them because women were actually wearing them. Like women were going to work in factories wearing them. That's why they had to ban them. but then those women still have the crinolines, so anytime they're not at work, they're still going to be wearing them. And again, a lot of places didn't ban them. There are a couple places that, I think I said this in the Hoopmania video, I think it was window shade painters, that the wide skirts of the women were actually smudging the paintings because they weren't, when they weren't dry. And so the owner or the proprietor of the business said, okay, so y'all need to start wearing the bloomer outfit, and the women all quit. Like, they were like, oh, give up crinolines? We'll just go work somewhere else, thanks. So women were quite attached to their crinolines. Again, I'll link that video below if you would like more detail on them. We're looking for something like the 90-inch circumference range to about 120, maybe a little bit more if you're super tall, but they really shouldn't be massive. You know, back in COVID, it was a popular thing of going, oh, everyone needs to start wearing crinolines so we can stay 6 feet away. I'm never more than like 2 feet away from the next person wearing crinoline. I find that a good shaped or good sized crinoline, if our skirts are just barely touching or about an inch apart, that's comfortable conversation distance. Anything closer, you're in my personal bubble. Thank you very much, and I would like you to move away. So crinolines aren't actually great for social distancing. The images that we see where they're massive or inconvenient or cumbersome, those are satirical images. The 19th century had a different version of humor than what we would typically see as humorous. Those are all, again, satire. So crinolines, extremely popular. We have 2 versions in this time period. We have the covered hoop. These are modern terms that I have come up with, okay? The covered hoop, which is the fabric hoop with the rungs inside, and then you have the wire ones as well. Both are perfectly appropriate. You see them sold side by side in stores. So it's not like one is more correct than the other, kind of going back to our garter, or was it stocking? One of the conversations when I said, yeah, garter, where I said, you know, one is not more correct than the other. They are both correct. We might be able to say one is more common than the other, but we're not going to be able to say one is wrong and one is right. I've actually been told on the internet that my covered hoop is wrong and they didn't have those back then. That's a costume hoop. And I'm like, I've handled originals, and I've also seen plenty of photographs, so they are correct. It's fine. And again, I've seen them sold side by side in period imagery in stores, so both are fine. I do think fewer people are wearing crinolines in living history than ought to wear crinolines, and even fewer still are wearing the right size and the right style and the right shape of crinoline. The lampshade crinolines or the very A-frame crinolines are not a thing. We need to make sure our crinolines are correctly shaped. The best kit for the wire one is very expensive, but it is from Needle and Thread in Gettysburg. It's a very nice kit. There are people who will make them up for you for a little bit more money, but they are very nice wire kits. I do have a video on how to make the covered cage very cheaply. If you already have like a modern crinoline, you already have like the wire and the stuff, I can teach you to make it very, very cheaply. And so I'll have that video up there for you as well if you would like it. So now let's talk about our last layer of underwear. So it's a petticoat that typically goes over top of your crinoline. Sometimes it's called an underskirt. These are going to be around skirt width in circumference, so somewhere in like the 110 to like maybe 150. I think 160 is the widest circumference I've seen. That doesn't mean they don't go wider, it just means it's what I've seen. I've only been studying for 10 years or so, so I obviously haven't seen everything that's out there. But somewhere in that circumference, these can be very highly decorated. They can be made of wool, they can be made of cotton. I've seen some silk ones. The fancier ones are usually meant for you to pick up your skirts, your outer skirt, like your dress skirt, to show up underneath if you're like walking in the streets or hiking or something like that. But also a plain petticoat works. You can decorate it with tucks, you can decorate it with white work, you can also leave them plain. All the above are totally fine. The primary purpose of this particular layer, if you are wearing a crinoline, it does soften the lines of the crinoline, gives you a nicer shape with your skirt, and it also hides the rungs of the hoop. If you're not wearing crinoline, it provides a little bit more skirt support, a little bit wider. That was a little bit more fashionable. The layers that you wear for your skirt supports really are somewhat personal preference. There are also corded petticoats that which are basically petticoats that have yarn woven into it. They were very rarely made with yarn that someone would do. Usually they were woven on purpose, like the fabric already had the yarn type material in it. So there's corded petticoats available. There were, again, wool ones, silk ones, quilted ones, white cotton ones are the most common, knitted ones. So many options for petticoats. But what I usually say is you typically want at least 2. Between 2 and 4 is normal. So if you're in pre-hoop time period, you're going to wear between 2 between 2 and 4 petticoats. Whatever layer you want to wear them in, generally you start with the shortest one and you go a little bit longer each time. Your topmost petticoat should still be a couple of inches, like 2-ish inches shorter than your dress skirt. Because you do want a little bit more of that walking room again. So if you're pre-hoop, I would say at least 2 petticoats, up to 4 petticoats, somewhere in there. These can be very nicely starched, gives you a little bit more poof, especially again before the crinoline. Now once the crinoline takes off, we can wear the 2 petticoats. It would be fairly uncommon after the hoop to only have the 2 petticoats. You'd usually want the crinoline there as well. I have also seen crinolines that do not appear to have a petticoat over top. Like you can definitely see the rungs of the hoop. So either it's a very light, thin petticoat over top, or if she's not wearing one at all, that could be an option for you as well. Particularly, I see this more often in like working environments than I would, a nicer dress. But just know that is an option technically too. So there's lots of options of how you layer your skirt supports. You can do petticoat, corded petticoat, and then a petticoat over top. You can do petticoat crinoline petticoat. You can do petticoat petticoat. You can petticoat crinoline. So many options, but you do need to look into your particular character and don't just assume. Don't just assume, oh, I'm a person on the prairie, so I'm not going to wear this, I'm going to wear this. Don't just assume. Like actually document, go back to paintings, go back to portraiture, go back to photographs, diary references, go back to all of those and see what you can document. Don't just assume that you know best, because our modern logic does not always equal 19th century logic. Different people, different cultures, different backgrounds, they think differently. They have different reasoning processes. So just because you think something is logical does not mean it would have worked for the 19th century. So now let's go ahead and move on to dresses. We're going to start by breaking down each part of the dress, starting with skirts. So skirt lengths for this time period are going to be just above the floor. For extreme working wear, you'll see them a little bit higher than the ankles sometimes, particularly with certain factory workers. I'm trying to think, fishermen wives in Scotland tend to have shorter skirts. Iron workers from Tredegar in Wales often had shorter skirts as well. Certain people groups had shorter skirts than others, but generally we're going to see around floor length or a little bit above floor length, a couple of inches or so. Yes, it looks hard to walk in. Again, if you're wearing the right layers, it should not be. And again, if you're working class and you're like actively working, you can always pin up those skirts. I have a video on pinning up your skirts for work, and your last petticoat should be a little bit shorter. It should give you more moving around room. So there's always options for you there. Remember that skirts are often cut longer than they appear. That excess is called turning. It's just turned under usually at the waistline, and that means that the dress can be remade over for someone taller down the road, or you can even turn that hem when that dress gets kind of nasty and gross at the bottom, turn it under and have like nice fresh clean fabric for your hem, and then turn under the bad part or one part. So we're going to see that turning. We call that balancing the skirt in modern time periods. I do have a video on that as well if you need more detail on that. I've seen very, very few original dresses without the turning, and I believe all of them have been like really working class, like not meant to be seen dresses. 2 of them were homespun. One was an 1830s dress. So as far as how wide your skirt should be at the circumference, we're looking at somewhere between 120 and like 180 inches, depending on the fabric, depending on the purpose of the dress. Again, material, all that kind of factors into how wide your skirt should be, your skirt circumference, like how big your hoop is. All of that can factor into how wide your skirt is. So I can't tell you like there's no formula for that, unfortunately. So it's more or less just getting an eye for it. This is how wide I need my skirt to be. You'll figure it out. It just takes a little bit of trial and error. Always a good thing to have a mannequin and put your underpinnings on the mannequin and put the fabric like on it and see if you can get the draping the way you want it to. That'll help figure out exactly how much circumference you want. And you're going to compare that to originals, not just what looks good to the eye. A lot of reproduction patterns, especially from the big four like Simplicity or McCall's, they have way too much yardage in the skirt. Sometimes these dresses call for like 11 to 12 yards of fabric, and that's just insane. I mean, yes, sometimes in the period they would call for that much fabric, but that's because if you have 24-inch wide fabric, you're going to need more fabric to make a dress than if you have 60-inch wide fabric. That's why sometimes there were a vast quantity of yardage in dresses. It wasn't just their fabric widths weren't standardized. They had wide fabric widths. I've also been told that they didn't have wide fabric widths like we do today. Even in the Workwoman's Guide, it does at least one type of fabric was about 108 inches in width could come off the loom. So they had wider fabric widths. They just had a more variety of fabric widths than we do today. Ours are standardized. We typically see 45-inch, which is now more 43, 44-inch, and then we also see more 60-inch fabric widths. And then we'll also have like the quilt backing widths as well. That's not how it worked in the 19th century. They had so many more options than we do today. And so you had, some fabrics, such as silk, could come in like 18-inch widths, or you can get the 36 wide inch silk. So it really just depended on the fabric width as to how much yardage you had to buy. But when you look at modern patterns and you see like 12 yards in a dress, that's insane. I am by no means a small person, and I can get a good, well-made 1860s dress out of 6 yards of fabric. I've done it in 5 yards with 60-inch wide fabric. Typically I use about 7 yards, even with some trimming. And even when I do 2 bodices on my silk dresses, I never use more than 8, even if I'm fully trimming out a dress. So it's just one of those things to keep in mind. If your pattern is calling for a lot of yardage, it probably isn't a very authentic pattern. And just watch the circumference of your skirt. You don't want it super, super big. That's how you get heavy skirts. You don't really want your skirt to be super heavy. Skirts in this time period are going to be made plainly, so like rectangular panels. They are not typically, I've never seen one where you take the fabric yardage and you just make it as wide as you want and then you seam up the one seam. That's not how we see dresses in this time period. We see them in panels, however wide your fabric is, and just cut it at the height you need it to. And just cut several panels to get whatever skirt circumference you need. We're not going to have gored panels in this time period. It's a little bit later. We'll talk about that when we talk about 1863 to whatever time period I'm doing after this one. Anyway, straight rectangular panels for petticoats and for dresses. Some skirts don't have pockets in them, or some original skirts did not have pockets in them. Most originals that I have handled or seen do have pockets installed in them. Most of the time I see them on the right side. Occasionally I see them on the left side. I suspect it is a left or right handed person difference. I haven't been able to confirm that, but that is my suspicion. The tie-on pockets I do believe to be a earlier time period thing. I've only seen one dress from this time period with pocket slits for tie-on pockets. So it does seem to be a fairly rare occurrence. Typically, if you're gonna have a pocket, it's going to be like sewn into your skirt. If you would like to set in a pocket in your skirt, I do have a video on how to do that. Now let's talk about the waist treatment of skirt, or how to get all that skirt compressed into your waistband. There's a couple of ways to do it. We can do gauging, which is called cartridge pleating today, but the period correct term is gauging. We can do pleating, which we would call knife pleats today, or we can do box pleats. Box pleats particularly after, when did they become popular? Like 1857, 1858, somewhere in there is when they become popular. And then they really take off, especially for silks and wools. Most cotton dresses and sheer dresses are going to be gauged. It just seems to be a prevailing pattern that I've seen, not all of them, but most of them. Silks and wools in this time period are going to be preferably pleated one way or the other in box or knife pleats, as opposed to gauge. Even with pleated dresses, you're typically going to have a section of gauging in the very back, and that's just to help you not have to get your pleat math perfect. It provides a little bit of expenditure, so you don't have to, again, get that math perfect. I do have videos on pleating, and I don't know if I have one on box pleating. That can come down the road if I don't. I know I have one on gauging that I will link for you. So there is a little bit of research in there that may prove useful for you if you were looking to figure out what to do with getting your skirt into that waistband size. As far as hemming our 1850s and 1860s skirts, most dresses in this time period are faced, which is a scrap bit of fabric, typically polished cotton, but not always. Sometimes it's scrap fabric or other types of fabric that is around the hem of your dress. This is put on for several reasons. One, it provides a little bit of weight, like a deep hem would create weight that would help gravity hold your skirt nicely or give it a nice drape. That is a desirable thing. However, doing that with an actual deep self-fabric hem is wasteful with your dress fabric. That can be kind of expensive. So doing it with a scrap fabric or with brown cotton or with polished cotton is a little bit more economical way to get that deep hem lay without actually having to sacrifice your expensive dress fabric. It also means that this is technically removable. So if your hem facing gets really nasty or muddy or whatever, you can always take it apart, wash it separately if you want to, or you can just replace it with a whole new one. First time I ever made a silk dress, I decided I was better than all those 19th century people, and I knew better. So I just did a self-fabric hem, which for silk taffeta was a very poor choice. I very quickly realized why we face silk, especially because my skirt, as I would move, just kept bunching at my hips because it needed the weight to hold everything down, and that's what a facing does. So I very quickly faced that dress. And what do you know, all those problems went away. It's almost like they knew what they were doing back then. Facings in this time period I find to be about 4 to 8 inches in width. You can just leave them raw at the top. I've seen most of them, the ones I see, are turned under to where there's, like a folded edge. That's how they would typically finish them. I've seen a couple that are kind of Van Dyke pointed edges. Not pinking shears. It's not the size of a pinking shear. They're much larger than pinking shears. It was like a little hand crank machine that would do them, like a scallop machine that would do the Van Dyke edges. My friend Susan has an original that she has that does the Van Dyke edges. That would be another way to finish them if you happen to have one of those machines. But generally the easiest and what most of us should be doing is either leaving it raw, particularly on dresses that aren't washed, like silks and wools, or you can turn them under if you actually want to wash the dress. As far as dresses that don't have facings, I typically see these being sheer dresses, which will have a large self-fabric hem. And then quite a few of the silk dresses from this time period are going to be lined, sometimes faced as well, but lined. Occasionally you'll see the wool ones lined. I don't believe I've come across a cotton dress that has a skirt lined. That doesn't mean they didn't exist. Again, just because I haven't seen it doesn't mean it didn't exist. It just means it's likely rare. Now on nicer dresses, such as silk and wool dresses, it is very common to have something called hem braid, which is usually wool. It's not like a twill tape. I know a lot of people like to use twill tape for this. It's not, or a bias tape. That's not what they look like. It's a wool braid that there's several ways to put it on. I do a video on putting in hem braid. Again, these are usually on nicer dresses. It just further protects that hem from wear and helps it last a little bit longer. Now let's talk about the bodices. In the beginning of our time frame, around 1853 or so, we're going to see waistlines sit mostly at the natural waist. By 1860, we're going to see it a little bit above, around half an inch to an inch above our natural waist. It gives us a little bit of a shorter torso look. That's just popular. It gives us not as quite of a long-waisted look. I think the most mistake I see people make with 1860s dresses is their waist is too long. We don't see that very often in the early part of the 1860s. Occasionally, yes, but generally they look a little bit shorter waisted. So it's usually just shortening your bodices just a tiny bit. There are lots of different bodice styles in this time period, and of course there's always that plain style. You have yoke styles, which is where it's fitted up here and then has fullness that can either be pleated or gathered. I've done a couple of yoke bodices on the channel. You can have a low corsage, which we would call a ball gown or an evening gown today. Typically they were just called low corsage. You can have V-neck bodices. Again, there's a lot of options there for you depending on the fiber that you're using, the cotton, silk, wool, that sort of thing, and the style of dress you're going for. There's also several ways to get the excess in from your waist to be fitted. There's always darts, which are mostly in this time period seen with silks and wools, not necessarily with cottons. With cottons, you're going to see more of the gathering or the pleating. Sometimes you'll have the lining of the bodice darted, where the fashion fabric gathered or pleated. But generally you won't see the outer fabric of a cotton darted. That's quite rare to see. And speaking of linings, with your bodice, you can do a whole lining, like line the entire thing. You can have a high-necked bodice, but with a low corsage lining, that's totally appropriate. You can do no lining at all. I don't see that very often, but you can do it, particularly with sheer dresses or sheer basques. Sometimes those are not lined. I've seen linings that are just under the arm just to catch excess sweat, and this is part of your bodice that's more, wears, but everywhere else wasn't lined. So there's lots of options for lining as well. It's not just one size fits all. Most nicer dresses are going to be lined with polished cotton. Occasionally, especially for like a cotton prints, you might see scrap fabrics from older dresses be used as the lining instead. Waists in this time period are typically going to be round, so like no V to the waist, unless of course we're talking about an evening gown or a ball gown. Sometimes those do have the V's in the front and in the back, but typically for day wear, we're almost always in this time period going to see that round waist. The exception to this would be the very earliest part of our time periods, 53, 54, 55, where sometimes we still do see a little bit of a slight V left over from the 40s. Many nicer dresses in this time period are going to be boned, typically in darts, sometimes at side seams, sometimes in the back. If you do have an evening bodice or a ball bodice that has a V, you will almost always, or I almost always, do see bones in there as well to help it lay a little bit nicer. In the 1850s, a popular bodice style was called a basque. It really throughout our time period we see it, not very commonly in 1862. It seems to be more of a British thing by that point, and they do end up coming back later in the 1860s, but a basque is basically a bodice with like a skirt or a peplum attached to it. And so these are commonly found in the 1850s of contrast fabrics, and they don't have to match your skirt. They are worn most generally with wool, silk, or sheer skirts, and the basque itself can be velvet, it can be silk, it can be wool. In the 1860s and the later part of the 1850s, you also see just the white waist, so it's just like a bodice itself that's mismatched. Again, those are almost always worn with sheer, silk, or wool skirts, and the fabrics that are used for these basque or these white waist or these wool waist even sometimes are very fine, very expensive materials, and they are more of a high fashion look than a typical dress. Like a one-piece dress is going to be the vast majority of what people are wearing, and anything deviating from that is a fashion choice, generally by more fashionable, more up-to-date, slightly more wealthier people are going to be wearing the mismatched look. Most dresses in this time period are going to close with hooks and eyes. Sometimes it is buttons and buttonholes, especially on very poor working class dresses. I see a preference for buttons and buttonholes because they are sturdier. On a nicer dress, if you want the look of buttons, you can do buttons and buttonholes, but more commonly you're going to do hooks and eyes, faux buttons essentially over top to make it look like you have a button closure. In the 1850s, sometimes we see like tassels there instead, just as, again, a little bit of a bodice decoration, but you still close with hooks and eyes. For evening dresses that close in the back, sometimes it's hooks and eyes, sometimes it is eyelets, typically hand-done eyelets. Trims for your dresses are going to change all the times with fashion. Cotton dresses are almost always trimmed with their own fabric, not necessarily a contrast fabric or a different fabric. The ones that are trimmed with different fabrics are almost always going to be wools or silks. The 1850s tended to prefer frillier, fuller trims than the 1860s did. But again, this is something to be guided by original garments. Find one that you like that's in your fiber that you're choosing to do, and of your general time period within a couple of years to kind of get an idea of what you want for your trim. Briefly touching on piping, dresses are piped in this time period. The vast majority of them are anyway. I have a whole video on piping that I will link below. Piping cord can be various colors. It is typically smaller than the sugar and cream yarn. I like to use a cotton pearl size 8 or size 10 is what I typically see in originals. And typically in this time period, we're going to have piping at the waistline, the arm side or the shoulder seam, and also the neckline. Occasionally you'll see it at other places like the shoulder seam, but generally it's just going to be at the neckline, arm side, and waistline. Piping in this time period should match the dress fabric. It should not be contrast piping. The exception to this would be children's clothing, and then occasionally with very high fashion silk dresses, occasionally there will be contrast piping in those. Now let's talk about sleeves. There are actually several different types of sleeve options in this time period. We have the bishop sleeve, which is popular throughout this entire time period. And even with the bishop sleeve, it's not just a bishop sleeve. You can have a full on top, full on bottom bishop sleeve. You can have more fitted at your shoulder and then fuller at your wrist. You can have it a little bit fuller up here and a little narrower down here. Like, there's options with even in the bishop sleeve itself. We see more of a funnel sleeve in the earlier part of the 1850s, which is kind of like that straight sleeve of the 1840s, just widened out a little bit. We see the pagoda sleeve become very popular in our beginning part of our time period, really reigning through most of our time period. I would say it's more or less out by 1861. Mostly by 1862, definitely, I wouldn't be wearing any pagoda sleeves except on sheer dresses. It does come back later in the war or post-war, but for our time period, pagoda sleeves mostly fine. You're going to see those again in sheer dresses, mostly wools or silk dresses though, not necessarily the cotton ones. The cotton does not lay right in a pagoda sleeve, unfortunately, so we just don't see that being done. In 1861, 1862, there's a brief surgence of the gigot, or like a mutton sleeve from the 1830s that pops up. Sometimes you'll see like a couple puffs up here and then like a tight sleeve in the same time period. Kind of looks like a gigot sleeve, but it's not. But again, that's kind of like a fashionable thing at the later part of our time period that you can do. See other types of sleeves. With really any of your sleeves, you can always do like a cap sleeve. You can do a couple of puffs up here and then have your sleeve underneath. Like, there's all sorts of options for sleeves. Again, this should be guided by looking at originals or with photographs. Sleeves can be fully lined, they can be unlined. I find lining more popular, particularly with thinner fabrics, because it's going to help things lay a little bit nicer. For evening sleeves, we see what I would call angel sleeves. I don't think that's a period term, but like the really full kind of puffy ones that aren't pulled into a band. They're just kind of puffy, full. They kind of look like wings. I don't know. That's what I call them. You'll see ones that are just the single puff sleeve. You'll see double puff sleeves. All sorts of sleeve options for evening wear as well. So even though it looks at first glance that everyone's wearing basically the same dress in the 1860s, there's actually a lot of variety within what they are wearing in terms of the colors or the styles or the fabrics. And again, you can change up a lot of the bodice styles that we talked about. You can change up trim, you can change up the sleeve options, the neckline options, the lining options, so that your dresses feel different from everybody else's. So now that we've pretty much talked about dresses, let's talk about accessories. We're going to first look at finishing off a neckline. So let's talk about collars. In the 1830s, In the 1850s, particularly in the earlier part of our time period, we're going to see quite wide collars, sometimes almost to our shoulder, and they get steadily narrower, about an inch or so by the 1860s. And so, again, wider collars in the 1850s, a couple inches, like 2 inches, later 1850s, and then an inch and a half or 1 inch by the end of our time period. Collars are a single layer. The double layer Peter Pan collars do not exist. They should be a single layer. They can be trimmed with tatting, with lace, with edging. They can be white worked or embroidered. They can be set plainly. That's totally fine. I have videos on how to make collars. I will link as well for you. Collars can be basted into your neckline. They can be pinned into your neckline. Don't be scared of straight pins. They're not scary if you put them in correctly. And mostly collars in this time period are going to be like bleached white, not off-white, not cream. I know it looks old-timey to us, but they would have had collars that were stark white. So white collars. Another option, particularly for working wear, you can always wear a neckerchief, or if you had a V-neck bodice, you can always wear a neckerchief. These are great for working wear. They're seen a lot in paintings as well, again for working class garments. And these can be printed or colored, not necessarily like, I guess printed, but colored, and then sometimes you'll see like checks or stripes or things like that on them as well. They're typically pretty small in this time period. There's lots of ways to put one in. You can just lay it over top. You can have it tucked into your neckline, tucked in, and then like have not a bow, but a knot out front. There's lots of ways to wear them. Again, this is something to be guided by portraiture or pictures. You can also, it's very rare, but occasionally you do see people without any type of anything on their neck. It's just like nothing. It's not necessarily recommended. There's actually reasons for wearing a collar and a neckerchief. One of those reasons is to keep all that sweat and the grime from your neck from getting on your actual clothes that you're not washing very frequently, because a neckerchief and a collar is easily removable. So you want those to be removable so that you can wash it and then put it back on the dress. But again, occasionally we do see dresses or people wearing dresses without anything on it. It's just quite rare to see. Another option would be a chemisette. This is a sort of under bodice, but typically it doesn't have sleeves. It's just almost like a bib that goes in the front and in the back. Sometimes it ties, sometimes it pins. Typically these do have collars attached. They are almost always like a sheer fine white fabric. They're found very frequently under V-neck dresses, particularly in the 1850s. And these can be highly decorated. Sometimes there's a lot of embroidery, sometimes it's tucked, sometimes it's shirring, sometimes they are left plain, sometimes it's just a collar that's decorated with some lace or something. So again, a lot of options there for what you want it to be. Typically if you do see them decorated, it's not the whole thing decorated. It's only decorated what's going to be shown under your bodice. So you typically would know like what your bodice would look like and what would be shown underneath, and you'd only decorate the parts that would be seen. Otherwise, it's just a waste of work. Let's talk about finishing off sleeves. So some sleeves that are close at the wrist, so like bishop sleeves, can be finished off with cuffs. There's a variety of cuffs. You see cuffs in leather. You see them mostly in white cotton or linen. They can be plain. They can be highly decorated with lace or embroidery, tatting. All sorts of fun things can be decorated with your cuffs. They come in a variety of different sizes and shapes. Sometimes they're very small and very plain, like a little rectangle. Sometimes they're more shaped. You have like a little V on top and they fold up. So many ways to make a cuff. With open sleeves, like your pagodas or your funnel sleeves, you can always have undersleeves underneath. A lot of these are going to be bishop sleeve in style. So they're going to be like nice and poofy underneath your full sleeve, and then you would have a wrist with a cuff on top of your undersleeve. Sometimes you will see, especially in the 1850s, you'll see open sleeves with the same style sleeve as your undersleeve. So if you had a funnel sleeve, you'd have a funnel sleeve undersleeve. It's a little bit of white, pretty frilly thing poking underneath. And again, it is something that's removable, that if you get dust or dirt or grime on your arm, it's going to touch the white part, your undersleeve part, but not your dress part. Again, your dresses aren't as washable as your accessories are. And it's also just pretty. Every once in a while you'll see portraiture, again, with nothing underneath, no collar, no cuffs, no undersleeves. It's just like an open sleeve. It's fairly rare compared to seeing a cuff or seeing an undersleeve. Now let's talk about actual accessories, so like a pelerine, for instance, or a fichu. Pelerines, fichus are more things that you would add over top. A lot of times, particularly fichus, are going to be very sheer, fine, dainty, very highly decorated. It's just something to add a little bit of detail to your dress. Oftentimes worn over evening dresses, but not always. They're just, again, usually very fine, light materials. It's just something to add a little bit more detail, dress up a dress that's a little bit plain, something like that. Pelerines can be crossed. Sometimes with sheer dresses, you'll have like a low cut sheer dress, and you have a pelerine that goes over top to give you a little bit more coverage, even though it's sheer fabric that you can see through. It's just, again, it gives you a little bit of a different look. You can add to your dresses. Both of those are great period options. Gloves. Gloves in this time period, even for evening wear, are going to end at your wrist. Those longer gloves are a later time period. You see them most often in kid leather, and you see them in a variety of colors. For evening wear, you're going to want to stick with white. For day wear, I've seen them yellow, buff, black, brown, blue, green. Really whatever color you want, you can probably get in a good leather glove. There are period patterns for things like mittens or that are crochet or knit or gloves. If you can net, there's always those beautiful little netted mitts. Those are not crocheted mitts. A very nice netted fingerless glove, a mitt done in silk would be a beautiful thing. I know a couple of people who can net who have done kits before. And it's one of those things I would really love to learn how to do because they're absolutely beautiful. But anything that you make like gloves or mittens or the mitts or something, just know that pay special attention to the size needle or the size hook or whatever you're doing and the size of thread or yarn to use. Those are not necessarily interchangeable as we would say today, we tend to like chunkier yarns, chunkier threads, and bigger needles or hooks because they're faster to work, whereas that is not what the 19th century liked. They prefer finer, more detailed work. And so a lot of what they would use is finer and smaller than what we would use for the same purpose today. So it's important to watch that sort of thing. Handkerchiefs. Handkerchiefs are actually something I see a lot of people do wrong. They use those little tiny vintage like 1950s, I call them coasters because that's the size they are. They're itty bitty. What are those used for? My goodness. But that is not what a 19th century handkerchief should look like. Handkerchiefs, about 17 to about 22 inches square. They are massive in our time period, but they also serve a lot of functions. I think that's one of the reasons we don't wear or use handkerchiefs very often anymore is because they became so tiny, dainty, and basically useless that they lost all their function, and so we just stopped using them. But far from being just a snot rag, there's a lot of ways you can use a handkerchief. Yes, handkerchiefs are good for sneezing into or blowing your nose into. They were also really good if you had to touch something gross like a doorknob, or your child is handing you something and they're sticky, or if you saw someone sneeze into their hand and then touch a doorknob, you can always use your handkerchief to turn that one next so you don't have to touch it. You can wrap a snack or your packed lunch in a handkerchief and eat out of it. You can wipe your dirty or sweaty face. You can use it to swat away flies or bugs. You can use it to wrap a wound or to blot blood, clean something. Handkerchiefs can be used to pick out something you'd rather not touch with your actual hand. There's so many good uses for a handkerchief. In Charles Dickens' Bleak House, which was published in 1854, so it is our time period, a baby passes away and the mother covers its body with the handkerchief. That wouldn't really work well if it was one of those little 1950s coaster squares, now would it? No, that does kind of tell us that it's a much larger ordeal. So it's something that's large enough to cover a newborn baby at least, which again is what we see in this time period. So I'd love for us to see some actual 19th century style handkerchiefs, some larger ones that are actually useful for things other than blowing your nose into. Handkerchiefs in this time period are going to be linen or cotton. They're typically going to be fine. Again, solid white generally. Even the embroidery, if you do any embroidery, should be done in white. It shouldn't have any colored embroidery. These are meant to be washable. Dyes are not necessarily the most stable things in the world, and so we want to make sure that they're white and we can get them nice and bleached. You can edge them with embroidery. You can edge them with lace. There's lots of patterns for embroidering a corner of a handkerchief or an edge of a handkerchief in all the ladies' books. So there's lots of ways you can decorate a handkerchief, but you can also just do a little narrow hem and have just a very plain handkerchief as well if that's what you prefer. I'm actually quite passionate on the subject of handkerchiefs. I love a good handkerchief. I carry one in modern life, and I always carry one in my period life. I actually have a separate handkerchief that goes into the pocket of every single dress. Like every single dress has an assigned handkerchief, so I'm never without a handkerchief. I love my handkerchiefs, and I'm quite passionate about teaching other people about the uses of a handkerchief. Probably needs to be a short at some point. All the ways you can use a handkerchief in the 19th century. I could see that being a short. Now let's talk aprons. There are basically two types of aprons. There's common aprons or like plain aprons, or there are like dress aprons or fancy aprons. Fancy aprons are going to be made of silk, very fine sheer cottons. These are often highly embroidered, silk embroidery, very highly decorated with embroideries or lace. These are things that you sit in the parlor and look pretty in. They're not necessarily work aprons. There are, again, fancy aprons. There are knitting aprons or sewing aprons that you specifically, if you're sitting in the parlor looking pretty and doing some light sewing, any thread would be attached to your apron. It would slide right off. A lot of these are silk aprons because threads won't attach themselves to silk. They kind of slide, again, right off. And so it's useful to have a silk apron when you're sewing so that, again, you don't get little threads sticking up all over your dress all the time. It's just They're easy to collect and they're easy to put away. And one happens to get away from you, it just slides right off to the floor and can be cleaned up later. It's very nice and convenient. And there's lots of different styles for fancy aprons as well. When we get to the start of the Civil War, even a little bit before, you do see patriotic aprons, particularly around elections and that sort of thing. But again, once the Civil War hits out, there are patriotic aprons that are worn to show support for the side. You see a lot of Confederate patriotic aprons in this time period. Most of them are going to be silk or wool. I think I've seen one original photo of one that was supposedly cotton. I don't always trust the people who say they're cotton. I think a lot of them are actually wools, but people don't know what 19th century wools feel like. But it could be. I don't actually know. It was a child's apron. That may make a difference. I'm not even sure. One day we are going to make a patriotic apron for a museum display. I meant to do it last December. Last December we were going to do it, and then I moved in December, wasn't able to do it. So it's scheduled for this following December. So we'll see how that goes. But yes, we are going to be making a patriotic apron and another silk fancy apron, because I technically have a black silk apron that I started when I first started Living History, which is almost 15 years ago. And that apron is still not done. So I might actually get it done this year if I don't push that video off any further. As far as common aprons go, there are two types. There's a bibbed apron, so it has, we would call it a pinner apron. I don't see that term very often. I usually see a bibbed apron. So it has like a portion on the top of the bodice as well that you'd pin in with straight pins. And then you'd have like the half apron, which is like the most common apron. I think there's too many people wearing bibbed or pinner aprons in Living History. Honestly, I think there's too many of them. When you look at portraiture and you look at photographs and you look at paintings, most women are wearing half aprons, not bibbed aprons. But when I go to events, I see most people wearing bibbed aprons. I think I have one bibbed apron that I probably need to do something with, honestly, because I'm trying to help us get to the period ratio of more people should be wearing half aprons. So I'm trying to wear more half aprons. Anyway, if you can, I would highly suggest a half apron, because I do think bibbed aprons are far overrepresented. Aprons in this time period are going to be typically cotton or linen. Typically they are not going to be solid unless it's solid white. That's a totally different story. White isn't a color by the 19th century standards, so if it's white, it doesn't count. But as far as colors, you can do print aprons, you can do checked ones, you can do striped ones. There's lots of options for your aprons as well in terms of color and design, or again, just plain white for a common apron. It works just fine. So now let's move on to headwear. Caps can be worn by people. I see them most often on older women. We tend to think that people of the 19th century or women of the 19th century had to have their hair covered, and that is not true whatsoever. We see plenty of bareheaded women that we know their identities and we know that they are respectable members of society. So it's perfectly fine not to have your hair covered. Older women can wear caps. They don't have to wear caps. For morning or breakfast, you can always wear a little morning or breakfast cap. I actually really like the breakfast caps and the morning caps of this time period. I find them absolutely adorable. They are so frilly. They're like little cupcakes that you get to sit on your head, and they're so beautiful and fine and delicate, and they're most beautiful materials. I absolutely adore them. I wish I had more opportunity to wear mine because they're gorgeous. Anyway, I really like caps at this time period, and it's unfortunate that they weren't worn by everybody, because I would love to see more of them. It is one of those things that if you have very short or very modern hair that you can't hide, a cap can help cover it. These fancier caps you can decorate with silk ribbons or lots of lace or frills. There's so many things to do with a really pretty cap, but again, they weren't worn by everybody and they certainly weren't common. Something else that we see are hairnets. These are typically very fine. They're the color of the wearer's hair, and they are going to be, sometimes they have ribbons over top and sometimes they don't. Sometimes it's just a plain net. Both are totally fine. These are generally not going to be crocheted. They're almost always silk, or sometimes they're even human hair. Again, they're supposed to match your hair. It's mostly just to keep the flyaways, even when you use pomade, there's usually a couple of hairs sticking out just to help keep your hair a little bit smoother. Snoods, as they are worn in terms of the crocheted, colored cotton things, those do not exist in the 19th century. There are similar things that are made of silk chenille that, again, are almost always netted, but even then, finding silk chenille would be very difficult. I don't know if I've ever seen it, actually. I also haven't looked. Maybe I need to look for that. Anyway. Those can be colored, but again, they're going to be silk. It's very specific circumstances. They are almost never crocheted. And if you do choose to wear something like a cap or a hairnet, your hair needs to be dressed first. It is not, you don't put loose spaghetti hair into those things. We dress our hair first, and then we put something over top if desired. We do not have to put anything over top, but if we want to, we can. As far as bonnets go, I'm going to defer to some people who actually know bonnets more than me. Timely Tresses, Danielle is the person I always go to for my bonnet questions, and she has very excellent patterns. She has something for all price points, so if you want to buy a finished bonnet from her and not to worry about it, you can do that. If you want to buy a blank and then trim it yourself, you can do that. If you want to buy a kit and make it yourself, you can. If you just want to buy the pattern and all the materials separate, you can do that as well. She has all the trimmings, all the ribbons, anything you want, directions on how to do things, directions on how to dress out a straw bonnet if you buy a straw bonnet. So many options, and Danielle has a vast collection of originals that she copies her patterns from. So they're very authentic, they're beautifully done. I love all my things from her. My favorite bonnet is actually something that Danielle did. I typically buy her patterns and do it myself. My favorite bonnet was one that Danielle actually made, which probably tells you I'm just not that great with milliners. You know, that probably is what all that means. And I find her directions very easy to follow. The very first bonnet I made, I was in high school. I don't think I'd ever followed a pattern before, and I was able to do it fairly successfully, completely hand-sewn. So it's absolutely doable even by somebody who's just not used to following directions. As far as trims on your bonnets go, this is also something that you're going to want to really look at portraiture and pictures for. In the 1850s, you're going to see a lot of trims just kind of as halo around the face all the way around. And by the 1860s, we see them more concentrated just at the top of the head. But again, that is something that changes with fashion, so it's something to watch out for in actual images that are dated. We actually know when they were taken to kind of follow some trends there. If you are more into hats than bonnets, hats are more of a high fashion item. Bonnet would be like the normal everyday wear, but if you're a little bit more fashionable, perhaps a hat would do for you. Anna Ward Bowersmith does excellent straw hats. Absolutely beautiful work. She does occasionally bonnets as well. I see mostly she does hats though. I own one of her open work straw bonnets from this time period. It is my second favorite bonnet. The only reason I think it's not my first is because I don't like the way I trimmed it. That's not her fault. That is a me problem. So beautiful work. Would highly recommend for hats or straw work. She does some very beautifully decorated pieces, and her hats are absolutely gorgeous. She also, if you are doing more winter activities and you need like a winter hood, she has several patterns for winter hoods this time period. I mean, she has ones for wadded hood. She has the one with the lapels. She has just plain ones that look a little bit more sunbonnets. So she has several options for winter hoods as well. And again, winter hoods can be made of silk, they can be made of wool. Typically they're lined in polished cottons, or at least the ones I have seen have been. A couple of them have had some calico lining in them as well. So many options, so many great varieties for that as well, and that would be another good source if you're looking for more of a winter hood. If you're wearing any sort of fashion bonnet or hat, you may want a veil. Veils are great. They're basically the sunglasses of the 19th century is what I call them. Black would be the most common color. You see them occasionally in white, not just for bridal stuff, and black doesn't mean mourning, it's just a thing. Blue, green, brown, red, purple. No, wait, not red. I've not seen red in this time period. I've seen pink in this time period, and purple once. But mostly it's going to be green, blue, brown, most often black, occasionally white for veils. Veils in this time period can be like silk gauze, they can be silk or cotton net, sometimes it's the dotted net as well. Bonnet veils in this time period are generally going to be the half moon veils or the half circular veils. In the very beginning of our time period, we might see some rectangular veils for bonnets. Hat veils in this time period are going to be square or rectangular usually. Well, those are very excellent for, again, sunshade, to keep your eyes protected from the sun. If you're using them for sunshade, I will say white is not very good for that. Black is the best. Blue and green and brown are all very good colors for that as well. It just has to do with the sun you're reflecting or absorbing into the fabric. But yeah, they do make very good sunshades. If you want more of a sunbonnet, these are not just for poor people. Rich people could have sunbonnets too. I find, honestly, a sheer white linen or cotton sunbonnet to be absolutely beautiful piece of work, and it can be worn by a variety of people. But even print sunbonnets or silk sunbonnets are absolutely around. There are two basic types of sunbonnets in this time period. We see ones that were made of cords or corded sunbonnets. We see the ones that have the slats. I know Danielle at Time and Tresses has a pattern for a corded one. Elizabeth Stewart Clark has free directions for 2 sunbonnets. If you want like an actual substantial pattern, I would suggest either Danielle or Marna Davis at the Domestic Ladies Dressmaker has 2 sunbonnet patterns for this time period. There's an 1840s to 1850s corded bonnet pattern, and there's the 1860s to 1870s slat bonnet pattern. both of them are absolutely beautiful, and Marna is another one who collects originals and copies her originals for her patterns, so she's an excellent resource as well. And again, some bonnets do not just have to be for poor people. They do not just have to be cotton prints. They can be sheer white cotton or linen. They can be silk. They can be like a wool gauze. So many options as well with that. And if you're going to do a fashionable ensemble such as a with a hat or a fashion bonnet, you're probably going to want a parasol as well. Nobody makes reproduction parasols that are anywhere near passable to the 19th century, especially the mid-19th century. Generally, people have originals that they have recovered. These are still for sale. Every once in a while, you'll see one pop up. They don't come up as much as they used to, but every once in a while they will. Parasols in this time period are generally very small, about 18 to 24 widths in diameter. So if you took the canopy and you just measured right across, that's the measurement that you're looking for. Most parasols in this time period do have metal bones, especially on the outer bones. In the early part of our time period, it is more common to see the rattan or the baleen, but by 1860 we see a lot more metal ones, except for in certain parts of Europe they tended to hold on to the baleen ones a little bit longer. Fringe is very popular in the 1850s for parasols. By 1860 we start seeing a lot more ruffles. It becomes popular. A lot of the parasols, especially the ones that we get today, are the foldable ones. Those are very nice because they fit in your lap when you're sitting in the carriage. They also fit in your pocket if you have a skirt pocket, so you don't have to carry it around everywhere. I really like my folding parasols. We're looking for something, with a wood, bone, or ivory handle. Sometimes there are tortoiseshell ones. The finial should be fairly small-ish. Well, they're fairly big in the early part of the 1850s. Sometimes, several inches. And by 1855, though, they get pretty small. A lot of times in this later part of our time period, they have like a little ring in them to hold it. Most parasols are going to be covered in silk. I do have one that I believe its original cover was cotton, mostly because the seller told me it came straight out of the trunk. It could have been recovered, I suppose, but it looks like it's an original fabric. Anyway, most of them are going to be covered in silk. These are not necessarily very expensive accessories, even though they are silk. We equate silk with being rich, and poor people didn't own silk. It was much more nuanced in the 19th century, so that is not always the case. And that's a conversation that we don't, quite frankly, have time here today to talk about. But yes, poor people can own silk, particularly with accessories. And then with other headwear, there's all sorts of things like evening headdresses, floral things you could wear in your hair, combs, so many other things that quite frankly you just don't have time for. For combs and jewelry purposes, which I didn't really talk about jewelry whatsoever. Combs and jewelry, I direct you to Beth Miller Hall. She has originals, she takes molds from them, and she makes reproductions of them. She has belt buckles as well. Other belt buckles, Ensembles of the Past sells excellent ones. She has one that's copied from one of the ones in the Steamboat Arabia. She has belting ribbon as well. I believe some millinery supplies has, Petersham ribbon that you can use for belting ribbon, like Judith M. Millinery is usually where I get mine. Etsy will sometimes have the cotton Petersham, but again, Ensembles of the Past is a good resource for that as well if you want a belt. Velvet ribbon can be used for belts. You can use silk fabric that you have to make belts. So there are lots of options for belts and belt buckles that we have today. I'm particularly partial to the sliding buckles that Ensembles of the Past has, and I'm also extremely partial to the clasping ones that Beth Miller Hall has. Those are my personal preferences anyway. You also see, leather belts for certain situations. There's, again, lots of options. We didn't even go to like purses or bags or baskets. Like, there's so many other things we could talk about that we could be here for hours and hours and hours. And I'm trying to give you like a basic outfit here, not necessarily going to all the facets that we could be going into, but trying my best here. So now let's talk about outerwear. That'll be our last section for today, is outerwear. This is the section I am the weakest in because I live in Texas. It does not often get cold enough to actually use any outerwear. I will say outerwear in this time period is not necessarily 21st century flattering. They preferred a lot of semi-fitted or unfitted outerwear, which doesn't necessarily fit with 21st century beauty ideals. Let's just say that. Anyway, shawls are actually an option. Shawls in this time period are generally quite large, around 50 to 60 inches in width. There's lots of different types of shawls. So you have the square ones are the most typical I see. They're about 60 inches. You on all sides. You fold it in half diagonally and you have a triangle to wear. You can also have just the triangle as a single layer shawl. I've seen ones that are rectangular that are twice as long as they are wide, and you fold it into a square first and then you fold it in triangle. Those are the warmest shawls because they're 4-layer shawls. There are the paisley ones. You can make them at home. I believe Anna Warden Smith has a book on shawls. It tells you like all the options, like the silk ones and the paisley ones, and there are sheer shawls that can be worn for summer that don't really add any heat, but just like soften the figure a little bit, just as like a fashionable accessory. So there's so many options with shawls as well, and shawls are great because they can function as blankets as well. So I have a lot of shawls. I like my shawls a lot. And then there are mantles, which are kind of like a shaped shawl. That's what I call them, shaped shawls. They are generally shaped throughout the shoulders. Sometimes they have arms, usually they don't, and they will just kind of flow out the front and flow in the back. I've made a couple of mantles of different shapes and patterns on the channel. I will link that video below as well. So there's just like a couple different varieties. I usually get them from ladies' books. Sometimes they'll have directions on how to do them. I think Godey's had one from like 58 or so that I've made up. I believe there's another one from like 1862 I've made. So anyway, I'll link them. They're basically shaped shawls. Generally, you're going to see these in wools or silks or sometimes velvets, and also sometimes in fur. I find them most often lined in silk. Some of these things are wadded or quilted for extra warmth. There's lots of different options depending on what you need in the climate that you are in. I've also seen mantles that are, again, super sheer. Not really for warmth, but just for pretty over top a summer dress. Cloaks, I think, are worn more often than they were in the period. You see them occasionally. You'll see some like hip length ones that are shorter. You'll see the really long ones, which take a lot of fabric to go over a crinoline, let's just say that. I find cloaks not to be super warm because there's like a lot of air in here. Typically I see the hoods on 1860s cloaks and mantles being non-functional, like they're decorative, and then you would have a separate hood that you would wear over top, so it's not like one of the medieval style ones that you just put the hood over. I find the hoods in this time period are generally decorative. That could just be something that I'm just noticing a pattern that's not there, but that's what I've noticed so far. There are also coats and jackets. Again, these are mostly going to be fitted, semi-fitted to non-fitted. They can be made of wool, they can be made of silk. There's a couple patterns for crochet ones. And then there's one in Peterson's 1855. It's called the polka jacket. When you make it up, because I've made up like a quarter of it and never finished it, it makes up to look like knit, which is just fascinating. Anyway, you see all sorts of knitted ones in this time period as well, mostly more knit than crochet, but occasionally, again, you'll see the crochet ones as well. But the jackets, paletots are like giant coats. They, again, can be semi-fitted as well, and they typically go a little bit more than hip length to knee length, somewhere in there, and they can be, again, quilted, wadded, mostly made of silk or wool mostly, and then lined again, usually, or at least faced with silk. Sometimes they are lined in cotton and just faced with silk or faced with silk fabric or something like that. And then there's like, you know, the knitwear, or generally it's not crochet wear in this time period. Generally for women it's going to be knitwear. I mean, scarves, gloves, mittens, which we kind of already talked about, hoods. There can be knitted hoods, there can be knitted caps, there can be wrapped like garments, sometimes called sontags. Even paletots or even cloaks can be knitted in this time period. There will be directions in Godey's Ladies Book or in Peterson's, sometimes in Author's Home Magazine. There are books specifically published for like knitting and crochet work that a lot of them are searchable online now. You can actually find those patterns for your particular time period and make them up if you are a knitter or a crocheter. Again, generally for women in this time period, it's mostly going to be knit. Very little crochet work for women in this time period. Most of it's going to be home furnishing and then children's wear. And then we get a lot more women's crochet work a little bit after our time period, just a little bit. So again, there's just so much more that we could get into that we didn't talk about pocket watches. There's so much that could make up a woman's wardrobe. This video is supposed to be more of an in-depth video, but it's also not supposed to be super overwhelming, going into every single little tiny facet and detail. It also can be difficult because the 19th century didn't always wrap up their language in nice, pretty packages for us. Sometimes they use the same word to describe multitude of different garments, or sometimes multiple different garments all had the same name. It can be quite confusing sometimes. And so the more you study, the more you'll get a grasp on it. It sometimes takes a little bit of time. I wanted this video to be thorough enough to where you felt like you had a good grasp on at least some of your options and know what you will need to at least make a basic outfit, but not to be super overwhelming to where you felt like just lost in all your choices. So I hope I have achieved that today. I hope it wasn't too overwhelming, but also I hope it wasn't not enough. You know, I hope it was somewhere in that happy medium. I guess we'll see. Because I feel like I've been talking a long time. but still not giving very much information. Anyway, those of you who have done 1850s and early 1860s living history longer than I have, I welcome any other resources or tips or tricks for other people that you have. I'll put them in a pinned comment below. Always nice to see other people's thoughts, because sometimes when I write scripts, I forget something, and sometimes even before the video will come out, I'll remember and go, I missed that major thing. I missed a whole section. So sometimes things just come to me later. So I know there's things I'm missing. Again, I'm trying not to make this like ridiculously overwhelming, but also give you a good overview. So I try to hit that happy medium, but I know there's probably things that could be talked about more or given, or more detail being given. So I'd welcome any tips or clarifications in the comments from people who've been studying longer than I have. Again, on this channel, we don't do hearsay. We don't do, oh, my grandmother told me. We don't do, well, this is just logical or this makes sense. We go back to the primary sources. If your grandma was born in 1880, then she is a really great resource for like 1880s and 1890s. She's not a great resource for the 1860s. So we stick with primary documentation. That's letters, that's newspapers, that's magazines, extant garments, photographs, paintings, documents, things of that nature. That's what primary documentation is. So that's what we stick to on this channel. If we can't document it, we don't state it as fact. Again, most of my research and my resources are geared towards American women, because that is where I reenact. That is where I do my living history. So any other resources that you have for other parts of the world, would love to pin it as well, because I know there are people who from all over the world that watch these videos, and I would love to give them some resources as well. Most of what I talk about, the very basic things, again, it's a very basic overview, will apply to most of the English-speaking world, so, and even Europe. So fashion started in France, and then they were taken to England and they were made more British. French fashions could be taken to America, and where they were Americanized. So there are all sorts of facets that are all similar, and the basics are all the same, but there may be slight differences and changes depending on where you are in the world. Next month in the Improve Your Impression series, we are going to be talking about how to make an outfit or how to dress a particular persona. We're going to talk about poor people first. With all that being said, thank you so much for listening to my current research on dressing an 1850s and early 1860s woman. If you've enjoyed the video, please like, subscribe to the channel, click that little bell notification so you're notified anytime I upload a new video. And as always, have a fantastic week, and I'll see you back here in the next video.